In the frozen silence of the Wyoming prairie, before the sun could rise, a mother made a choice that would change everything. With nothing but courage and 3 fragile lives in her arms, she stepped into the unknown, chased not by wolves, but by something far more dangerous: injustice. What would you do if the law itself came to take your children away?
4 o'clock in the morning. Wyoming cold is a living thing. It doesn't knock. It seeps through the floorboards. It settles in your marrow. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, wrapped in a faded wool shawl, staring at the dead ashes in the stove. I held a piece of paper in my hand. A court summons. My fingers didn't shake. I didn't cry. Tears are just water, and water freezes out here. I learned a long time ago in the blood-soaked dirt of the Shenandoah Valley that crying doesn't stitch a wound. Crying doesn't set a broken bone. And it certainly wouldn't save my children. I looked toward the bedroom door. The hinges were slightly crooked. My husband Thomas had meant to fix them before the fever took him. Behind that door, my 3 children were sleeping. William, my oldest, trying too hard to be a man at 12, Abigail, 8 years old and afraid of the wind, and little Samuel, 4 years of pure, unbroken innocence. That room was the only place in the world where I allowed myself to feel fear. I looked back down at the paper. The trap was set. The jaws were closing. Arthur Vance, my late husband's older brother, had finally made his move. The words on the page were formal, cold. They accused me of being a woman of unstable mental capacity. They claimed that as a widow I lacked the financial means and the moral fortitude to raise 3 children alone. But I knew how to read between the lines. Arthur didn't care about my morals. He didn't care about William, Abigail, or Samuel. He cared about the 200 acres of prime grazing land Thomas had left in my name. In the eyes of Laramie, I was a tragedy, a poor widow who needed to be managed. Managed meant controlled. Arthur had hired a sharp-suited lawyer from Denver. The hearing was set for Monday. Today was Friday. I had 3 days before a judge who regularly dined at Arthur's table would bang a gavel and strip away my children. Then, the land. I walked over to the hearth. Underneath a loose stone lay a small clay jar. I pulled it out and turned it over. 3 silver dollars and a handful of copper pennies clattered onto the pine table. It was enough for about 2 weeks of flour and beans. It wasn't enough for a lawyer. I had sold the horses. I had sold the wagon. I had sold Thomas's good Sunday coat just to keep the tax collector off the porch for another season. There was no money left. There were no relatives back east waiting to take us in. My only friend in town, the pastor's wife, had stopped making eye contact with me after Arthur threatened to pull his funding for the church roof. I was entirely alone, but I am Eleanor Vance. I have held the hands of dying men while artillery fire shook the earth. I have brewed willow bark and stitched torn flesh by the light of a single candle. I know what a lost cause looks like. This piece of paper was not a lost cause. I walked to the stove, struck a match, and touched the flame to the corner of Arthur's court summons. I watched the thick parchment curl. I watched the black ink turn to gray ash. I had made my decision. I wouldn't be here on Monday. I was going to Coldwater Creek. It was a 4-day walk across the prairie. But in Coldwater Creek lived Judge Josiah Carter. He was a federal magistrate now, but 14 years ago, he was a Union captain. He had watched me pull 32 of his men from the brink of the grave in a makeshift field hospital. He knew exactly what kind of woman I was. If I could reach him before Arthur's local judge made a ruling, I had a fighting chance. I didn't wait for the sun. The sun brings neighbors. The sun brings Arthur's hired hands pretending to check on my fences. I moved quietly. I took 2 heavy canvas sacks. Into the first I packed the dried meat, the last of the cornmeal, 2 canteens of water, and a small iron pot. Into the second I packed a change of clothes for the children, our heavy wool blankets, and the leather-bound medical journal from my days in the war. I didn't pack anything to remember Thomas by. Memories are heavy. I could only carry survival. By 2 in the morning, the house was stripped of everything that mattered. I went into the bedroom. The air was frigid. I knelt by the bed and gently shook William's shoulder. He woke instantly, his eyes wide, defensive. "Get up, Will," I whispered. "Don't light the lantern. Wake your sister. Keep her quiet." He didn't ask questions. He saw my face in the moonlight. He nodded, sliding out of bed. I gathered little Samuel into my arms. He was warm, smelling of sleep and soap. He mumbled something and buried his face in my neck. I wrapped my shawl around him. Abigail stood by the door, rubbing her eyes, clutching a ragged cloth doll. "Mama?" she whimpered softly. "It's dark." "I know, sweet girl," I said, keeping my voice steady. A low, rhythmic hum. "We're going on a trip. Just the four of us. But we have to be quiet as field mice. Can you do that for me?" She nodded, her lower lip trembling. We stepped out the back door. The wind hit us like a physical blow. The Wyoming prairie stretched out before us, an ocean of black grass under a canopy of cold, hard stars. There was no path, just the dark outline of the distant ridge. We walked. The first hour was a numb blur. I carried Samuel. William carried the sack of food. Abigail held tight to the hem of my skirt. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot in the still night. I kept looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the orange glow of torches from Arthur's men riding us down. By the third hour, my arms were burning. Samuel was a dead weight against my chest. Abigail was stumbling, her small boots dragging in the dirt. "Mama, my legs hurt," she cried softly. "Keep moving, Abby, just a little further," I urged. But my own breath was coming short. Then I heard it. The sound carried on the wind before I could see anything. The heavy, rhythmic thud of horse hooves. The distinct rattling groan of wooden wagon wheels on hard-packed dirt. Someone was coming down the trail behind us, heading out of Laramie. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. At this hour, it could be a drifter, or it could be Arthur's men. There was nowhere to hide. The prairie was flat and unforgiving. The moon was too bright. I looked frantically around. A few dozen yards away, the trail dipped slightly where a small creek used to run. I dragged the children into the shallow ditch, pressing them flat against the cold earth. "Face down. Do not move. Do not breathe," I hissed. The wagon rolled closer. It was a massive freight wagon pulled by two heavy draft horses. The back of it was piled high with burlap sacks and crates, completely covered by a thick canvas tarp. I watched it approach. The driver was a silhouette against the stars. A broad-shouldered man, sitting tall, the brim of his hat pulled low. He wasn't rushing, just a steady driving pace. I looked at my children. Abigail was shivering violently. Samuel was starting to wake, squirming in my grip. We wouldn't survive 4 days on foot in the open. We just wouldn't. The cold would take them before Arthur ever did. I had 30 seconds. It was the most reckless thing I have ever done. "When the wagon slows at the bend, we run," I whispered to William. "You boost Abby up. I'll hand you Sam. We get under that tarp, understand?" William stared at me like I was insane, but he nodded. The wagon hit the slight incline of the trail. The horses slowed, straining against the weight. The wheels creaked. "Now," I breathed. We broke from the ditch. We ran silently on the soft dirt. I reached the back of the moving wagon. I grabbed the edge of the canvas and threw it up. William scrambled up the wooden tailgate, hauling himself over the edge. I grabbed Abigail by the waist and practically tossed her into William's waiting hands. Then Samuel. The wagon jerked. I lost my footing, my knees dragging in the dirt. I grabbed the tailgate, my boots scrambling for purchase. I hauled myself up, throwing my weight forward over the wooden planks, just as the horses crested the incline and picked up speed. I pulled the canvas tarp down tight behind us. It was pitch black under the heavy fabric. The air smelled of grain, dry hay, and leather. The wagon bounced violently. I huddled my children together in the small gap between the towering burlap sacks and the wooden side of the wagon bed. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. We were in. But then the wagon shifted. The canvas near the front bench fluttered open. Just a fraction. An inch of moonlight cut through the darkness. Through that narrow gap, I saw the driver turn his head. He didn't yell. He didn't pull back on the reins. He just turned, looking over his shoulder, right through the gap in the canvas. The moonlight caught his face, a hard, weathered jaw, eyes that had seen too many harsh winters. He looked straight into the shadows. He looked right at me, and then his gaze dropped down, resting for a long, heavy second on the 3 terrified children pressed against my chest. I stopped breathing. My hand instinctively went to the small carving knife tucked in my skirt pocket. He knows, he sees us. This is it. He'll stop the wagon. He'll throw us out, or worse, turn the horses around and sell us out to the sheriff for a silver piece. The man stared at us. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head back to the road. He clicked his tongue. He flicked the reins. The horses kept their steady pace. He didn't stop. He didn't ask a question. He said absolutely nothing. The gap in the canvas fell shut. In the sudden, suffocating darkness, William grabbed my arm. His fingers were digging into my sleeve. He was shaking. Not from the cold, from anger, from humiliation. "Mama," William whispered fiercely, his voice cracking. "We're hiding like thieves. We're treated like strays. Uncle Arthur takes our home, and now we're begging rides in the dirt. We aren't anything anymore." I reached out in the dark. I didn't stroke his hair. I grabbed him by the shoulders, my grip firm and grounding. "Listen to me, Will," I said. My voice was low, but it cut through the rattling of the wagon wheels. "Listen carefully. Poverty does not strip away our human worth. Do you hear me? Not ever." He sniffled, trying to pull away, but I held him tight. "No man has the right to steal our family's freedom just because I'm a woman," I told him, making sure every word was clear, making sure he understood the weight of it. "The law they wrote in that town is built on the lie that we are less. But we are not less. A human being's value isn't decided by a judge or a deed to a piece of land. It is decided by our own hands and our own spirit." William looked up. I couldn't see his eyes clearly, but I could feel his attention lock onto me. "We are not fleeing because we are guilty," I continued, speaking the truth aloud so the darkness couldn't swallow it. "We are fleeing in the dark tonight so we can stand tall and claim our basic right to live tomorrow. Equality isn't a gift that men like your uncle will ever hand to us. It is a right we are born with. And sometimes, William, you have to survive a bitter night to have the strength to fight for your equality in the morning. We hide today, so we never have to hide again." William let out a long, shaky breath. His shoulders finally dropped. He reached over and pulled little Samuel closer to him, wrapping his own thin coat around his brother. "I understand, Mama," he whispered. I leaned back against the rough burlap sacks. The wagon rocked rhythmically beneath us, carrying us further away from the life I knew and deeper into the wild unknown of the prairie. I closed my eyes. The driver up front hadn't said a word. I didn't know his name. I didn't know where this wagon was heading. I only knew that when a man looks into the dark, sees a desperate woman with 3 children, and chooses to keep driving in silence, the real danger isn't the road ahead. It's hoping that for once the silence might be a safe place to rest. Morning came slow. The black sky bruised into purple, then bled into a pale, dusty gray. The wagon hadn't stopped. Not once. Under the heavy canvas tarp, the air grew stifling. The smell of raw grain and old burlap was thick in my throat. My legs were completely numb. I had held Samuel against my chest for so long I couldn't feel my own arms. Beside me, William sat rigid. He hadn't slept a wink. He just stared at the canvas, waiting for the trap to spring. Abigail was curled into a tight ball against my side, her breathing finally deep and even. Then the rhythm changed. The heavy thud of the horses' hooves slowed. The wagon wheels ground against loose gravel. We were veering off the main trail. The wagon rocked, dipped, and finally, with a loud creak of timber and leather, it rolled to a dead halt. My stomach dropped. A heavy silence fell over us. Only the sound of the horses blowing air through their noses. Then the unmistakable crunch of heavy boots on gravel. He had stepped down from the bench. The footsteps walked down the length of the wagon. Slow, deliberate. They stopped right beside us. I pulled Samuel tighter. I found the handle of the carving knife in my pocket. I didn't want to use it. Lord knows I didn't. But I was a mother, cornered. The canvas ripped backward. The sudden morning light was blinding. I squinted against the glare, bringing one hand up to shield my eyes. Standing there, silhouetted against the pale Wyoming sunrise, was the driver. Up close, he was a mountain of a man, broad shoulders framing a chest that looked like it was carved out of oak. He wore a faded canvas coat and a flat-brimmed hat. His face was deeply tanned, lined around the eyes from years of squinting into the sun. He didn't hold a rifle. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired. He stared down at us. I stared right back. I kept my chin level. I refused to cower in the dirt like a beaten dog. For a long minute, the only sound was the wind moving through the sagebrush. Then he reached into a leather saddlebag slung over his shoulder. He pulled out a heavy cloth bundle. He didn't say a word. He just tossed it. It landed with a soft thud on the floorboards right by William's knee. The man reached out, grabbed the canvas tarp and pulled it back down, plunging us into the dim shadows once more. I heard his boots crunch against the gravel as he walked away. I heard the splash of water, a creak. He was watering the horses. William reached for the cloth bundle with shaking hands. He pulled back the fabric. Inside was half a loaf of dense cornbread and a thick cut of dried venison. "Mama," William whispered, his voice cracking. "He gave us his food." I looked at the bread. Pride is a hard thing to swallow, but pride doesn't feed hungry children. I broke the cornbread into pieces. I woke Abigail and fed her. I gave Samuel the softest parts. I made William eat before I took a single bite for myself. It tasted like ash, but it was life. When they were done, I wiped my hands on my skirt. "Stay here," I told them. "Keep out of sight." I climbed over the burlap sacks. I pushed the canvas flap aside and stepped down from the back of the wagon. The morning air was razor sharp. We were in a small draw surrounded by rolling hills of pale grass. The man was kneeling by a narrow stream, splashing cold water on his face and neck. He stood up as I approached, wiping his face with a blue kerchief. I stopped 10 feet away. I stood perfectly straight. "I know you saw us last night," I said. My voice was steady. "I won't insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise." He looked at me. His eyes were the color of slate, hard and unreadable. "I'm not asking for charity," I continued. "I need to get to Coldwater Creek. I don't have money, but I am not a helpless woman. I know how to work. I can cook, I can mend, I know livestock, and I know medicine. I can pay my way with my own 2 hands. I will earn every mile." He wrung out his kerchief. He tied it around his neck. He looked at me, then looked past me toward the trail. "I know Arthur Vance," he said. His voice was like a low rumble of thunder, deep, rough, like it hadn't been used in a long time. Those 4 words hit me like a physical blow. If he knew Arthur, he knew the power Arthur wielded. He knew the trouble I was bringing with me. "Then you know why I had to run," I said. "I know Arthur Vance," he repeated softly, "and I know he ain't a good man." He walked past me, heading for the front of the wagon. He climbed up onto the driver's bench and picked up the heavy leather reins. He looked down at me standing in the dirt. "It's too rough in the back," he said. "Bring the kids up. You can sit on the bench. Kids can sit in the boot right behind it. Better than riding with the grain sacks." I just stared at him. He was offering us a seat in the open, offering to be seen with us. "Why?" I asked. He didn't look at me. He looked at his horses. "Get your kids, ma'am. We're losing daylight." I didn't argue. I went back, helped William lift the younger ones out, and we climbed up to the front. The bench was wide enough for me and the driver. The kids huddled together in the open compartment right behind us. The wagon lurched forward. We were back on the trail. We rode in total silence for 4 hours. The sun climbed higher, baking the chill out of the air. The man beside me didn't speak. He didn't ask my name. He didn't ask what Arthur had done. He just drove. Around noon, we stopped to rest the horses under a small grove of cottonwood trees. The man climbed down and began unhitching the team. I immediately got to work. I gathered dry brush. I built a fire. I took his iron pot, went to the creek, and boiled water. I found his coffee grounds and made a pot. I did it efficiently, staying out of his way. I was paying my debt. While I worked, a boy stepped out from the dense brush near the creek. He had been riding ahead on a dun-colored pony, scouting the trail. He looked about 10 years old. He had the same dark hair as the driver, the same slate-gray eyes. He walked into the camp, completely silent. "That's Caleb," the man said. It was the first time he had spoken since sunrise. "My son." I offered the boy a warm smile. "Hello, Caleb. I'm Eleanor. This is William, Abigail, and Samuel." Caleb didn't reply. He didn't nod. He just stared at us with a wide, blank intensity. He walked over to a nearby log, sat down, and began picking up small pebbles from the dirt. William, holding Samuel by the hand, frowned. He walked over to the man who was checking a horse's hoof. "Mister," William said, his voice loud. "Your boy, is he simple? He didn't even say hello to my mother. That's just rude." The man went perfectly still. His back tightened. He didn't turn around. The silence that fell over the camp wasn't peaceful anymore. It was dangerous. I dropped the coffee tin. I crossed the camp in 3 long strides and grabbed William by the arm. I pulled him back, forcing him to look me in the eye. "William Thomas Vance," I said sharply. He flinched. He knew that tone. "You listen to me, and you listen well," I told him, making sure my voice carried across the camp. "You never, ever judge another human being for the battles they are fighting inside. A person's voice is not the only measure of their mind, and it is certainly not the measure of their worth." William looked down, his face flushing red. "Look at me," I commanded softly. He raised his eyes. "Some wounds bleed where you can see them. Some wounds happen deep inside the mind or the spirit. They can take away a person's words, but they do not take away the human being. Do you understand? Caleb is a person deserving of the exact same respect, dignity, and kindness that you expect for yourself. Understanding someone who is different and giving them grace is the foundation of basic human decency. We do not mock what we do not understand. We respect it." William swallowed hard. "Yes, Mama. Go apologize," I said. William walked over to the log where Caleb sat. Caleb hadn't looked up. He was lining up 5 white pebbles in a perfectly straight row. "I'm sorry, Caleb," William said quietly. "I spoke out of turn. I didn't mean disrespect." Caleb didn't look up, but his hand paused over the pebbles. Down by the fire, little Samuel toddled over. He didn't know about apologies or manners. He was 4. He just liked rocks. Samuel plopped down in the dirt right next to Caleb. He picked up a dark, smooth river stone. He reached out and carefully placed it at the end of Caleb's row. William tensed, ready to pull his brother back. But Caleb didn't push Samuel away. Caleb looked at the dark stone. Then he picked up another white pebble and placed it next to Samuel's. A silent conversation. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I turned around. The man was standing by the horses, watching me. He had heard every word I said to William. The hardness in his eyes had cracked just a fraction. "Silas," he said. His voice was low. "My name is Silas Thorne." "It's a good name," I said. Silas turned back to his horses. He didn't smile, but as he tightened the cinch on the harness, his movements were just a little less rigid. That night, we camped beneath a sprawling, endless sky. I lay on the hard ground with my children tucked around me. I watched Silas sitting by the fire. He was awake. He had his rifle across his knees. He was watching the dark, keeping the prairie at bay. He wasn't doing it for money. He wasn't doing it for thanks. I closed my eyes. For the first time since my husband died, the darkness didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a shield. We reached the Thorne Ranch late on the 3rd day. It wasn't a pretty place. It wasn't built for comfort. It was built for survival. The main house was made of thick, rough-hewn pine logs, weathered gray by the brutal Wyoming winters. There was a large barn, a sturdy corral, and miles of wire fence stretching out across the rolling prairie. It was vast. It was isolated. And it was exactly what I needed. Silas pulled the wagon into the yard. He set the brake and wrapped the reins around the lever. "This is it," he said. I climbed down. The kids tumbled out of the back, stretching their cramped legs. I looked around. The place was incredibly well kept, but it lacked a certain warmth. There were no flowers near the porch, no curtains in the windows. It was a place where men worked, slept, and woke up to work again. Silas led us to a small, secondary cabin 50 yards from the main house. It was originally built for ranch hands. It was a single room with a pot-belly stove, 2 wooden bunks, and a sturdy table. It was dry. It was clean. "You can stay here," Silas said, standing in the doorway. "No one comes out this far unless I invite them. Arthur Vance's men won't find you here by accident." I turned to face him. "We need to set the terms, Silas." He leaned against the door frame, crossing his massive arms over his chest. "Terms. I am a fugitive from a corrupt court," I said plainly. "By hiding me, you are taking a risk. By feeding me and my children, you are taking a loss. I told you I would pay my way, and I meant it. We need an agreement." Silas looked at me for a long moment. He didn't interrupt. He listened. Truly listened. That was a rare thing for a man in these parts. "I have 300 head of cattle," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "Winter is coming early this year. I can feel it in my bones. I lost 2 good ranch hands a month ago to a gold rush rumor up in the Dakotas. It's just me and Caleb right now. I need help." He looked at William. "The boy can handle the chickens, the firewood, and mucking out the stalls. Nothing too heavy." He looked back at me. "Coldwater Creek is 6 miles from here. If you help me keep this ranch from going under before the snow hits, I will put a roof over your head. I will feed your kids. And when you are ready, I will hitch the wagon and drive you right to Judge Carter's front door myself." I didn't hesitate. I held out my hand. "Agreed." Silas looked at my hand. It was small compared to his, calloused and rough from years of hard labor. He reached out and took it. His grip was firm, warm, and calloused. We shook like 2 men closing a cattle deal. No pity, no charity, just business. The next morning, the business began. I was up before the sun. I found the supplies in the main kitchen, fired up the massive iron stove, and had coffee, bacon, and biscuits waiting when Silas walked in from the barn. He stopped in the doorway, surprised by the smell. He didn't thank me with words. He thanked me by eating 4 biscuits. By sunrise, I was out in the yard. I didn't ask what needed doing. You don't survive a ranch by waiting for orders. I saw a section of the western corral fence leaning heavily to the left. The posts were rotting at the base. I found a heavy mallet, a crowbar, and a coil of thick wire in the barn. I hauled the tools out to the fence. The wind was biting, whipping my skirt around my ankles. I tied my hair back with a scrap of cloth, rolled up my sleeves, and got to work. I dug out the loose dirt. I braced the heavy wooden post with my shoulder, grunting with the effort as I forced the timber back into a vertical line. I grabbed the wire, looping it tight around the joints, pulling it with all my body weight to secure the hold. It was grueling, back-breaking work. But every strike of the hammer felt good. It felt like I was rebuilding my own life, piece by piece. I was so focused, I didn't hear him walk up. "You're wrapping the wire too tight on the lower rung," a deep voice said. I stopped. I wiped the sweat from my forehead with the back of my wrist. Silas was standing on the other side of the fence. He held a pair of heavy leather gloves in one hand. I looked at my wire wrapping. I was about to apologize. I was about to step back and let the man do the man's job. That was what Arthur expected. That was what the world expected. But Silas didn't take the wire from me. He didn't step in to take over. Instead, he tossed the heavy leather gloves over the fence. They landed at my feet. "If you pull it that tight in the cold, the wire will snap when the temperature drops tonight," Silas said mildly. "Give it a half-inch of slack. The metal shrinks in the freeze." I stared at the gloves. Then I looked up at him. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have started without asking how you run your fences. I overstepped." Silas frowned. It wasn't an angry frown. It was a deeply confused one. He stepped closer to the fence, resting his thick forearms on the top rail. He looked me dead in the eye, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Listen to me, Eleanor," Silas said, his voice ringing clear in the cold morning air. "You do not need to apologize for working hard, and you certainly don't need my permission to fix a broken thing." He pointed a thick finger at the fence. "You don't work beneath me. Do you understand? Out on this prairie, a woman's sweat and skill hold the exact same value as a man's. Neither one is worth more than the other. You stand on this dirt as my equal, and I respect your right to make your own choices and use your own mind, just as deeply as I respect your work." I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my throat. I had spent my entire life being told I was too loud, too stubborn, too independent. I had been dragged into a courtroom because society believed a woman couldn't stand on her own 2 feet. And here, in the middle of nowhere, a man who barely spoke was handing me my dignity. "I explicitly believe," Silas continued, his tone absolutely serious, "that treating a woman as property or treating her as fragile glass is the mark of a weak man. A strong man wants a partner who can hold the line with him. So put the gloves on, Eleanor. Leave a half-inch of slack. And when you're done, come down to the barn. We have a calf that's turned sideways in the womb." He turned and walked back toward the barn. I stood there for a long time. I looked down at the heavy leather gloves. I picked them up. They were too big, but they were warm. I pulled them on. I adjusted the wire, leaving the slack, just like he said. That night, the real test came. At midnight, Silas knocked heavily on the cabin door. I was awake instantly. I threw my coat over my nightdress and stepped out into the freezing wind. "She's dying," Silas said. He was holding a lantern. His face was grim. "The calf is breached. I can't turn it. My hands are too big. I can't reach far enough." "Show me," I said. We ran to the barn. Inside, it was warm and smelled of blood and panic. A massive Hereford cow was lying on her side in the straw, breathing in harsh, rattling gasps. Her eyes were rolling back. I didn't hesitate. I threw off my coat. I rolled my sleeves up past my elbows. I grabbed a bucket of warm water Silas had waiting, scrubbed my hands and arms with lye soap, and knelt in the bloody straw. "Hold her head steady," I ordered. Silas didn't question my tone. He immediately moved to the cow's head, gripping the heavy halter, throwing his immense weight against her neck to keep her from thrashing. I took a deep breath, reaching inside the animal. The heat was intense. The pressure of the contractions was crushing against my arm. I closed my eyes, visualizing the anatomy. I felt the calf. 2 hooves, but they were pointing the wrong way. "It's backwards," I gritted out, the muscles in my shoulder burning. "And the head is tucked back." "Can you turn it?" Silas asked, his voice strained as the cow thrashed. "I have to, or they both die." I pushed forward. It took everything I had. My arms shook with the effort. I ignored the blood. I ignored the smell. I found the calf's jaw. I hooked my fingers behind it. "Push!" I yelled to Silas. "Hold her down!" With a violent twist of my wrist and a heave of my shoulder, I forced the calf's head forward. I grabbed the front legs. "Got it!" I gasped. "Pull! Now!" Silas grabbed the ropes I managed to loop around the calf's hooves. We pulled together, both of us straining, boots slipping in the bloody straw. With a sickening slick sound, the calf slid out onto the barn floor. It lay perfectly still. I dropped to my knees, scrambling forward. I cleared the mucus from its nose and mouth with my bare fingers. I grabbed a handful of rough straw and began rubbing the calf's chest vigorously, trying to stimulate the lungs. "Breathe," I ordered. "Come on, breathe." Nothing. I didn't stop. I kept rubbing, pressing hard against the ribs. "Don't you quit on me!" Suddenly the calf's chest heaved, a sharp, wet intake of air. It coughed, shook its head, and let out a weak, bleating cry. I slumped back into the straw, completely exhausted. My arms were coated in blood up to the elbows. My hair was plastered to my sweaty face. I was shivering violently from the adrenaline crash. I looked up. Silas was sitting on an overturned bucket. He was covered in mud and sweat. He was looking at me. He wasn't looking at me like I was a fragile widow. He wasn't looking at me like I was a problem to be solved. He looked at me like I was a soldier who had just held the line. Silas reached over. He picked up a clean rag, dipped it in the water bucket, and handed it to me. "Good work, Eleanor," he said quietly. I took the rag. Our fingers brushed. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of something that wasn't fear. It was belonging. "Good work, Silas," I replied. We sat there in the quiet barn, listening to the sound of the newborn calf breathing, the two of us sharing a silence that finally felt like home. A ranch doesn't give you time to heal, it just gives you work, and work, I found, was its own kind of medicine. A week passed. The days bled into one another. Wake before the sun. Break the ice in the water troughs. Feed the stock. Mend the gear. Cook the meals. Sleep. Do it again. I fell into the rhythm of the Thorn Ranch. Silas and I moved around each other like two gears in a watch. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. I knew when he needed strong coffee. He knew when I needed a heavier axe for the firewood. But my oldest boy, William, was a different story. William was 12. But in his mind, he was 20. He carried the weight of his father's death like a stone in his pocket. He thought it was his job to be the man of the house. He thought being a man meant being hard. I saw it starting on a Tuesday. We were in the barn. Abigail was trying to help William carry a heavy wooden bucket of oats. She tripped over a loose floorboard. The bucket spilled. Oats scattered everywhere into the dirt. Abigail scraped her knee. She sat in the hay and started to cry, a soft, frightened whimper. William didn't help her up. He stood over her. His face was tight. His fists were clenched. "Stop crying, Abby," he snapped. His voice was too loud in the quiet barn. "Tears don't pick up the grain. Quit acting like a fragile little girl. Toughen up. The world doesn't care if you're sad." Abigail shrank back. Her crying got worse. I dropped my pitchfork. I started walking toward them. The anger was hot in my chest. I wasn't going to let my son talk to his sister like she was a burden, but Silas got there first. He stepped out from the shadow of the horse stalls. He moved quietly for a big man. He walked right up to William. He didn't yell. He didn't raise a hand. He just stood there. He cast a long, heavy shadow over the boy. William looked up. He tried to hold his ground. He puffed out his chest. Silas knelt down. He looked at Abigail first. He pulled a clean blue cotton handkerchief from his coat pocket. He handed it to her. He waited until she wiped her eyes. Then Silas stood back up. He looked down at William. "Walk with me," Silas said. It wasn't a request. William swallowed hard. He looked at me. I gave him a curt nod. He followed Silas out the barn doors and into the bright, cold Wyoming morning. I followed them, keeping my distance. I stopped by the corral fence. I needed to hear this. Silas stopped near the water trough. He turned around. He looked William dead in the eye. "You think you're protecting your mother by acting hard," Silas said. His voice was a low rumble. "You think snapping at your sister makes you look tough. You think that's what a man does." William crossed his arms. "My pa died. My uncle is trying to steal our home. Somebody has to be tough." "Tough is one thing," Silas said. "Cruel is another." Silas took a step closer. The air between them was charged. "Listen to me closely, William," Silas said, his words ringing out sharp and clear. "Violence and a hard temper don't make you a man. Shouting at folks who are smaller than you doesn't make you strong. It makes you a bully. Becoming a real man means knowing how to protect the vulnerable. It means treating women with absolute respect no matter the circumstance. And it means taking responsibility for your own actions and your own words, even when it's the hardest thing to do." William stared at him. The defensive posture started to melt. "A weak man demands respect through fear," Silas continued, speaking the educational truth directly into the boy's face. "A strong man earns respect through kindness and control. Your sister tripped. She was hurt. A man helps her up. He doesn't kick her when she's down just to prove he wears the boots." Silas didn't blink. He held William's gaze. You want to be the man of your family? Silas asked. William nodded, his eyes watering slightly. Yes, sir. Then start by carrying the weight instead of dropping it on others, Silas told him. True strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about how much you can care for the people around you. Go back inside. Clean up the grain. Apologize to your sister. Silas turned his back. He walked away toward the pasture. William stood there for a long time. Then his shoulders dropped. The false bravado vanished. He was just a 12-year-old boy again. He turned around, walked back into the barn, and did exactly what he was told. I leaned against the fence. The wind bit at my cheeks. I watched Silas walking away, a solitary figure against the vast, empty prairie. I had never heard him string that many words together. He saved them for the things that mattered. The quiet settled over the ranch again, but it didn't last. Thursday afternoon, the sky was the color of bruised iron. A storm was brewing over the mountains. I was on the porch mending a torn canvas sack. Caleb and Samuel were sitting on the steps. They were trading a carved wooden horse back and forth. No words, just sharing. A rider came up the trail. He was pushing his horse hard. Lather coated the animal's neck. Dust kicked up in a massive cloud behind him. Silas stepped out of the barn. He held a lever-action Winchester rifle in his right hand. He didn't point it. He just held it. Casual. Ready. The rider pulled up into the yard. It was a young boy from the general store in Coldwater Creek. He looked terrified. He looked at Silas. Then he looked at me. "Mr. Thorne," the boy gasped, trying to catch his breath. "My boss sent me. Said I had to ride fast." "Spit it out, son," Silas said. "There's men in town," the boy said. "Strangers, wearing Laramie dust. They're buying drinks at the saloon, asking questions, showing a piece of paper with a woman's name on it." My blood ran cold. I stood up. The needle slipped from my fingers. "What name?" I asked. The boy looked at me. "Eleanor Vance. They're looking for a widow and 3 kids. Said she stole property. Said there's a court order." Silas stepped forward. His knuckles were white on the rifle stock. "Who is leading them?" "A man in a fine wool suit," the boy said. "Rides a black gelding. Answers to the name of Arthur." Arthur. He had found us. The trail was supposed to be cold. We had left in the dead of night. But Arthur Vance was a man with deep pockets. Deep pockets by fast trackers. "There's more," the boy said, swallowing hard. "The judge in Laramie sent a wire to Judge Carter. The hearing ain't on Monday anymore. They moved it up. They're having it tomorrow morning in Coldwater Creek. They said if you don't show, you forfeit the kids by default." Tomorrow. We had less than 24 hours. The boy turned his horse around. "I gotta get back. Boss said not to get involved." He spurred his horse and bolted back down the trail. Silence fell over the yard. The heavy, suffocating silence before a tornado touches down. I looked at Silas. I expected him to tell me to pack my bags. I expected him to tell me to get off his land. I was bringing the law down on his quiet life. I was bringing a storm he didn't ask for. Silas looked at the dust settling on the trail. Then he looked at me. He didn't panic. He didn't flinch. He racked the lever of the Winchester. A brass shell flew out and hit the dirt. A fresh round slid into the chamber. "Get your coat, Eleanor," Silas said softly. "The wind is picking up." They came at dawn. I didn't sleep. I sat in a wooden chair by the window of the cabin all night. I watched the horizon line turn from pitch black to a dirty, bleeding gray. I heard the horses before I saw them, the rhythmic thud of hooves on hard-packed dirt, the jingle of silver spurs and heavy bit chains. I stood up. I smoothed my skirt. I checked my pockets. I didn't have a weapon. My weapon was my mind. I walked out of the cabin and stood in the cold morning air. 3 men rode into the yard. In the center was Arthur Vance. He looked exactly as I remembered. Impeccable. He wore a heavy wool coat, perfectly brushed. His boots shone. He sat on his black gelding like a king surveying a conquered province. His face was sharp, handsome in a cruel way. To his left was a hired gun from Laramie, a heavy-set man with a scar across his chin and a hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. To his right was Sheriff Dawes of Coldwater Creek. He wore a tin star on his chest and looked uncomfortable. They stopped their horses 10 yards from the porch of the main house. I didn't run to the house. I walked deliberately across the yard. I stood halfway between the riders and the porch. I put myself between Arthur and the barn where my children were hiding. "Eleanor," Arthur said. He smiled. It was a cold reptilian thing. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, riding out in the middle of the night, stealing my brother's children." "They are my children, Arthur," I said. My voice didn't shake. "And I didn't steal them. I rescued them from a thief." Arthur sighed, adjusting his leather gloves. "Always the dramatic woman. Always too much fire, not enough sense. This ends today. The hearing is in 3 hours. Sheriff Dawes here is going to escort you to town. The children will ride with me." "No, they won't," a voice thundered. The front door of the main house swung open. Silas Thorne stepped out onto the porch. He didn't look like a simple rancher anymore. He looked like a wall of solid granite. He carried a double-barreled shotgun. It wasn't slung over his shoulder. It was held across his chest. Ready. Arthur's eyes narrowed. He looked Silas up and down. "And who are you?" "I own the dirt your horse is standing on," Silas said. "Name is Thorne." Arthur smirked. "Ah, the silent rancher. I've heard of you. Look, Mr. Thorne, I don't want any trouble. This is a family matter. The woman is unstable. She has a history of hysteria. I have a court order for her to appear, and an order to take custody of my nephew and nieces for their own safety." Arthur reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He waved it at the sheriff. Sheriff Dawes cleared his throat. He nudged his horse forward. "Now, Silas, don't do anything foolish. Mr. Vance has the paperwork. It's all legal. I have to serve the warrant. Hand over the woman." Silas didn't blink. He didn't move. "You can serve your paper in a courtroom, Dawes," Silas said. His voice was dangerously calm. "But out here on my land, you don't take anyone against their will. Put the paper away, or I'll blow a hole in your saddle." The hired gun tensed. He started to draw his revolver. Silas shifted the shotgun. The twin barrels pointed directly at the hired man's chest. "Draw it. See who's faster." The yard was dead silent. The wind whipped the dust around our boots. Nobody moved. Death was hanging in the air, waiting for an invitation. Then a scream shattered the morning. It didn't come from us. It came from the corral behind the barn, a high-pitched, terrifying yell of pure agony, followed by the frantic sound of splintering wood and a horse whinnying in a blind panic. Silas broke his stance. I spun around. We ran toward the corral. Arthur and the sheriff spurred their horses and followed. By the fence, an older ranch hand named Jed was lying in the dirt. Jed was 60 years old. He had been trying to break a green Mustang. The Mustang had spooked. Jed was on his back. His right leg was twisted at a sickening, unnatural angle. Worse, his chest was rising and falling in jagged, shallow gasps. Blood was already bubbling at the corner of his lips. He had been kicked in the chest, hard. Silas dropped his shotgun. He fell to his knees beside the old man. "Jed, don't move. Lie still." Sheriff Dawes dismounted. He took off his hat. "Lord Almighty, the nearest doctor's in Coldwater Creek. It's an hour ride. He won't make it. He's bleeding inside." Arthur looked down from his horse. He looked bored. "A tragic accident. But we have business in town, Sheriff. Let's wrap this up." I ignored them. The world narrowed down to a single point. The battlefield came rushing back to me, the smell of copper, the sound of failing lungs. I wasn't a widow right now. I wasn't a fugitive. I was a surgeon. I shoved past the sheriff. I dropped to my knees in the dirt next to Silas. "Give me room," I snapped. I didn't ask. I commanded. I ripped Jed's heavy canvas shirt open, popping the buttons. A massive purpling bruise was blooming across his ribs on the right side. I placed my hands flat against his chest. I felt the bone structure. 3 broken ribs, I said rapidly. 1 is displaced, it's punctured the lung lining. That's why he's coughing blood. The lung is collapsing. We have to stabilize the rib and relieve the pressure. Silas looked at me. He didn't question me. What do you need? I need a clean knife. I need boiling water. I need whiskey. Strong whiskey. And I need a hollow reed or a thin, clean leather tube. Now! William had run out from the barn. I'll get the water, Mama. He bolted toward the house. I have a knife, Silas said. He pulled a sharp hunting blade from his belt. Clean it with the whiskey, I ordered. Sheriff Dawes stepped forward. He looked horrified. Are you crazy? You're a woman. You can't cut a man open. You'll kill him. Mr. Vance said you were unstable, but this is madness. I didn't even look up at him. I took the whiskey Silas handed me. I poured it directly over Jed's chest. Jed groaned in agony. Hold his shoulders, I told Silas. Silas locked his massive hands onto Jed, pinning him to the dirt. Sheriff, Arthur sneered from his horse. Arrest her. She's clearly lost her mind. This is exactly what the judge warned us about. I stood up. My hands were covered in Jed's blood. My dress was stained. I looked directly at Sheriff Dawes. I looked at Arthur Vance. I let the absolute freezing calm of a combat veteran settle over my face. Listen to me, and listen carefully, I said. My voice cut through the wind like a razor. Your laws might be written to treat women and children as property to be traded, Sheriff, I declared, speaking the absolute truth so loudly it echoed off the barn walls. But human conscience dictates otherwise. A woman's intelligence is not a crime. Her skill is not madness. I pointed a bloody finger at Arthur. A mother's right to her children and her right to live as a free, equal human being do not depend on any man's permission or a piece of paper bought with bribes, I stated explicitly. I am a human being. I am not a piece of inventory, and right now, I am the only thing standing between this man and a wooden box. So you will shut your mouth, step back, and let me do my job. Sheriff Dawes took a physical step backward. He looked terrified of me. Arthur's face flushed dark red with fury, but he didn't say a word. William ran up, handing me a hollowed-out piece of river reed he had cleaned and a bottle of iodine from the barn kit. I knelt back down. I took the sterilized knife. I found the space between Jed's broken ribs. I took a breath, and I made the cut. Blood welled up instantly. I inserted the hollow reed into the pleural cavity. A sharp hiss of trapped air escaped, followed by a rush of dark blood. The pressure released. Jed took a sudden massive gasp of air. His eyes flew open. He was breathing. The rattling stopped. I grabbed thick wads of clean linen Silas had brought. I packed the wound tight around the reed. I took long strips of canvas and bound Jed's chest tightly, immobilizing the broken ribs. The lung is inflating, I said quietly, tying off the bandage. He needs to stay flat. He needs to stay warm. But he will live. I sat back on my heels. I wiped my bloody hands on a rag. I looked up. Silas was watching me. The hard, stoic mask he always wore was completely gone. In its place was absolute, unfiltered awe. He was looking at me like he had never truly seen a woman before. He didn't see a fragile widow. He didn't see a burden. He saw a warrior. Silas stood up. He walked over to his shotgun in the dirt. He picked it up. He racked the lever again, just for the sound of it. He pointed it directly at Arthur Vance. The hearing is at 9 o'clock, Silas said. We will be there. Now get off my land before I forget my manners. Arthur glared at me. He looked at the bloody knife in the dirt. He turned his horse around. I will see you in court, Eleanor, Arthur spat. And I will ruin you. He spurred his horse and rode out. The sheriff and the hired gun followed close behind. The dust settled in the yard. Silas knelt down next to me. He reached out. His large, calloused hand covered my bloody, trembling fingers. Get your journal, Eleanor, Silas said softly. It's time to go to war. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to support more journeys like this. I washed Jed's blood from my hands. The water in the tin basin turned a pale, rusty pink. I scrubbed my skin with coarse lye soap until it burned. I dried my hands. I smoothed my hair. I walked out to the wagon. Silas was already there. He had hitched his fastest team. The shotgun rested against his boot. We left the children with Caleb. We left Jed resting in the quiet of the barn. Silas gave the reins a hard snap. The horses surged forward. The ride to Coldwater Creek was a blur of dust and wind. Silas didn't speak. He kept his eyes locked on the horizon. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was focused. It was the silence of two people walking into a burning building. Coldwater Creek was a rough timber town, dirt streets, false front buildings. The wind blew loose tumbleweeds past the saloon doors. We didn't go to the courthouse first. We went to a small whitewashed house at the end of Elm Street. The brass plate on the door read, "Josiah Carter, retired." I knocked. An older man answered. He had white hair and walked with a cane, but his eyes were the same sharp, calculating blue I remembered from the Shenandoah Valley. "Eleanor," Judge Carter said. His voice was thick with age, but warm. "I got the wire from Laramie. I knew you'd come." He let us in. His study smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. Another man was sitting in a leather chair by the fire. He was young, early 30s, wearing a rumpled brown suit. He had ink stains on his fingers. "This is Nathaniel Hayes," Judge Carter said, leaning heavily on his cane. "I can't hear your case, Eleanor. I stepped down from the bench last spring, but Nathaniel is the best legal mind in this county, and he doesn't care much for Arthur Vance." Nathaniel stood up. He offered his hand. I took it. His grip was firm. "Mrs. Vance," Nathaniel said, "I read the injunction Arthur filed. He is using the mental instability clause. He is claiming your time as a war nurse damaged your mind. He says you are unfit to manage money or children." I felt the anger flare hot in my chest. "He is lying," I said. "He wants the 200 acres my husband left me. The children are just the leverage." Nathaniel sighed. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I believe you. But believing isn't the law. In 1878, the law looks at a widow and sees a liability. A judge will look at Arthur, a wealthy established man, and see a safe harbor for those children. The burden of proof is entirely on you." "That is exactly what needs to change," I said, stepping closer to the young lawyer. I made sure my voice was level, but it rang clear in the small room. "Listen to me, Mr. Hayes," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "A legal system that dismisses a woman's voice as hysteria just to steal her property is not justice. It is organized theft. Equality under the law means a woman has the absolute right to defend her sanity, her children, and her property without needing a man to speak for her. A mother's devotion is not a mental defect. And I will not let a corrupt court tell my daughter that she is a second-class citizen simply because she was born a woman." Nathaniel stared at me. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "You have fire, Mrs. Vance," he said quietly. "I like fire, but fire doesn't hold up in court without a sworn witness. We need someone who can testify to your character, someone who has seen you work, someone who isn't related to Arthur." I opened my mouth to speak, but a heavy hand rested on my shoulder. Silas stepped forward. He reached into his thick canvas coat. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. It had a red wax seal on the bottom corner. He handed it to Nathaniel. "What is this?" Nathaniel asked. "An affidavit," Silas said. His voice was a low, steady rumble in the quiet room. "I wrote it last night. Took it to the town notary before sunrise this morning. It's sworn and sealed." I looked up at Silas. He had written it last night? While I was sitting by the window in the dark, he had been fighting for me with a pen. Nathaniel unfolded the paper. He read it in silence. His eyebrows slowly rose. He looked up at Silas. "You wrote this?" "Every word," Silas said. You state here that she performed complex veterinary surgery under extreme duress, Nathaniel read. You state she manages an entire ranch's logistics, cares for 4 children, and displays the most sound, rational mind of anyone you've ever met. It's the truth, Silas said simply. It's a shield, Nathaniel said. He folded the paper and slipped it into his breast pocket. Arthur is expecting a hysterical, broken woman begging for mercy. He isn't expecting a sworn affidavit from the most respected rancher in Coldwater Creek. Let's go to the courthouse. The courthouse was loud. It smelled of sweat and cheap cigars. Arthur was sitting at the plaintiff's table. He looked supremely confident. Sheriff Dawes stood behind him. The judge hit his gavel. It was a preliminary hearing, a formality. Arthur expected the judge to sign the kids over right then and there. Arthur's lawyer stood up. He gave a long, flowery speech about my fragile feminine nature. He talked about my husband's tragic death. He talked about my reckless flight into the night. Then Nathaniel stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't wave his arms. He simply walked to the judge's bench and handed over Silas's affidavit. Your Honor, Nathaniel said, my client is not fragile. She is employed. She is housed. And her mental fortitude is vouched for by Mr. Silas Thorne, a man this court knows well. We motion to dismiss the emergency injunction and demand a full trial with proper evidence. The judge read the paper. He looked at Silas, who was standing in the back of the room like a stone pillar. The judge cleared his throat. He banged his gavel. Emergency custody denied, the judge barked. I will grant a 2-week extension for a full trial on the matter of the property and the children. Court adjourned. Arthur slammed his fist on the table. His face was purple. I let out a breath I'd been holding for 6 days. 2 weeks. It wasn't a victory, but it was time. We walked out into the sunlight. Thank you, I said to Silas. He just nodded. Let's go home, Eleanor. You have chores to do. Night fell hard on the Thorne Ranch. The wind died down. The sky was clear, scattered with a million chips of ice they called stars. The children were asleep in the cabin. Jed was resting comfortably in the main house, his breathing shallow but steady. I walked out onto the porch. Silas was already there. He was sitting on the top step, his long legs stretched out into the dirt. He had 2 tin cups of coffee steaming on the wooden planks beside him. I sat down next to him. I took a cup. The heat soaked into my cold palms. We sat in silence for a long time. It wasn't the tense silence of strangers anymore. It was the comfortable silence of 2 people who had fought a war side by side and survived the day. You wrote that paper before Arthur even showed up in the yard, I said softly, staring out at the dark prairie. I did, Silas said. Why? I asked. You don't like words. You don't like getting involved. Why did you put your name on a legal document for a woman you found hiding in the back of your wagon? Silas took a slow sip of his coffee. He rested his forearms on his knees. He didn't look at me. He looked up at the stars. Martha died 5 years ago, Silas said. His voice was incredibly soft, almost a whisper. It was the first time he had spoken his wife's name to me. It was a fever, he continued, like your husband. I was out on the range, trying to save a herd of cattle from a blizzard. I thought the cattle were the most important thing. I thought securing the money would keep her safe. By the time I got back to the house, she was gone. Caleb was sitting beside her bed. He hasn't spoken a single word since that day. My heart physically ached. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to touch his arm, but I kept my hands wrapped around my coffee cup. People talked, Silas said, his jaw tightening. They said I was an unfit father. They said a man who couldn't even get his own son to speak had no business raising a child alone. Some folks from town tried to petition the church to take Caleb away, send him to an orphanage in Denver. He finally turned his head. He looked right at me. I know what it feels like to have people judge your family without knowing a damn thing about the love inside your house, Silas said. I saw you that first night in Laramie. I pulled the canvas back. I saw a woman terrified out of her mind. But I didn't see a criminal, Eleanor. I saw a mother fighting for her blood. I chose to stay quiet because I recognized the fight. I swallowed hard. The tears were right at the edge of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I have spent my whole life feeling like I was too much, I whispered. Too loud, too stubborn, never just right for the world. The world is wrong, Silas said simply. You are exactly what you need to be. It was the most intimate thing a man had ever said to me. There was no desperate touching, no rushed kiss in the dark, just absolute terrifying honesty. We went to sleep that night feeling like the ground beneath our feet was finally solid. But the prairie doesn't let you rest. The twist came the very next afternoon. It didn't come with men and guns. It came in a simple paper envelope delivered by the post rider from Coldwater Creek. I stood in the dusty yard staring at the letterhead. It was from the Laramie National Bank. I read the words 3 times. My stomach turned to lead. The paper fluttered in the wind. Silas walked up from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He saw my face. He stopped. "What is it?" he asked. "Arthur?" I choked out. He couldn't get custody immediately, so he attacked the land. I handed Silas the letter. He read it quickly. His jaw locked. "He bought out your mortgage from the local lender," Silas said, reading the fine print. "He moved the debt to the Laramie Bank, and he paid them to call the note in early due to abandonment of property. They are demanding the back taxes and the remaining balance in full." "By Friday," I said. My voice was hollow. 3 days. If I don't pay the balance in 3 days, the bank forecloses. The land goes to public auction. Arthur will buy it for pennies. If I lose the land, I lose my home address. Without property, Nathaniel said the judge will definitely grant Arthur custody. I lose my kids. I dropped to my knees in the dirt. The fight went completely out of me. Arthur had won. He had found the one wall I couldn't climb: money. "How much is the total?" Silas asked. "Silas, $400, I whispered. It might as well have been $1 million. Silas folded the letter. He put it in his pocket. He looked down at me. "Get up, Eleanor," he said. I looked up. "It's over, Silas." "Get up," he repeated, holding out his hand. I took it. He pulled me to my feet. "I have $400 in a strongbox under my floorboard," Silas said firmly. "I sold a herd in Cheyenne last month. I'll ride into town right now. I'll wire the money to the Laramie Bank. The debt will be cleared by tomorrow morning." I stared at him. The relief was a sudden, blinding flash. But right behind it was a cold, hard shadow. My whole life, I had been owned, first by my father, then by my husband. When Thomas died, I finally tasted what it meant to own myself, to survive on my own sweat. If Silas paid my debt, I would owe him $400. I would owe him my land. I would owe him my children. I would owe him my life. I stepped back. I pulled my hand out of his grip. "No," I said. Silas frowned. "No, Eleanor, this isn't the time for pride. They are going to take your children." "It's not pride, Silas," I said, my voice rising. "It's my life." "It's paper," Silas shot back, his temper finally cracking. "It's a piece of paper in a bank. I have the money. It's yours. Take it." "And then what?" I demanded, stepping toward him. "Then I belong to you. Then I work for you for the next 10 years to pay it off. Or worse, I just become the grateful little widow who owes her savior everything." Silas looked like I had slapped him. "I am not Arthur. I am not trying to buy you." "I know you aren't," I cried out. I forced myself to breathe. I looked into his eyes. I needed him to understand. I needed to state it so clearly that neither of us could ever doubt it. "Listen to me, Silas," I said, my voice shaking but resolute. Financial dependence is a cage. It doesn't matter if the cage is built by a cruel man like Arthur or a kind, good man like you. A cage is a cage. True freedom for a woman means owning her own debt and her own success. I cannot teach my daughter to be an independent human being if I run to a man to rescue me with his wallet every time the world gets hard. If I let you pay for my freedom, it isn't freedom anymore. It's just a new master. Silas stared at me. His chest heaved with heavy breaths. He was angry. He was frustrated, because he wanted to fix it and he couldn't. But he was also a man who understood the truth when he heard it. He slowly lowered his hands. The anger drained out of his posture, leaving a deep, grudging respect. "You are the most stubborn creature God ever put on this prairie," Silas said quietly. "I have to be," I answered. "Then how do we fight him?" Silas asked. "Without money, what do you have left?" I looked toward the cabin. I thought about the heavy canvas sack under my cot. I thought about the blood, the mud, and the screams of the Shenandoah Valley. I had kept it hidden because I wanted to leave the war behind. But the war had followed me. "I have my mind, Silas," I said, turning back to him. "And I have the proof of what it can do. Get the wagon ready. We're going back to see Nathaniel." The ride back to Coldwater Creek was fast. I didn't look at the scenery. I looked at the heavy canvas sack sitting on the floorboards between my boots. It felt like it weighed 100 pounds. It was full of ghosts. Silas pulled the wagon up to Nathaniel Hayes's office. He didn't come inside. He stayed on the bench, holding the reins, keeping watch. I walked into the dusty office. Nathaniel looked up from a pile of law books. He looked exhausted. "Mrs. Vance," he said, standing up, "I've been trying to find a loophole in the banknote. It's ironclad. If you don't have the $400 by Friday, the land goes to auction." I didn't say a word. I walked to his desk. I opened the canvas sack. I pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. The cover was stained with dark, faded spots that looked like rust. It wasn't rust. I dropped it heavily onto the center of his desk. "What is this?" Nathaniel asked. "Arthur says my mind is broken," I said. "He says my time as a nurse made me hysterical, unfit to manage a household or a dollar." I flipped the book open. The pages were filled with my tight, meticulous handwriting. "That is my medical journal from the Shenandoah Valley," I told him. 300 pages, 214 separate surgical procedures, dosages, symptoms, outcomes. I documented every man I saved and every man I lost. I made decisions in the dark, under artillery fire, that seasoned doctors couldn't make. Nathaniel stared at the open page. His eyes scanned the precise clinical descriptions. "This is incredible," he whispered. "Arthur wants to put my sanity on trial," I said. My voice was cold. "Let him. You put that book in front of the judge tomorrow. Let Arthur explain how a hysterical, broken woman managed the triage of an entire infantry regiment." Nathaniel looked up at me. A slow, sharp smile spread across his face. "It proves extreme competence," Nathaniel said, tapping the pages. "It completely destroys the foundation of his custody petition." "Then do it," I said. I walked out of the office. The air felt lighter. I had finally stopped running from my past. I was using it as a weapon. When we got back to the ranch, the tension was thick. Silas and I had fought earlier. It was the first real fight we ever had, and the echo of it was still hanging in the air. William was chopping wood too hard. Abigail was quiet. And Caleb was hiding. I walked into the barn to check on Jed. Caleb was sitting in the darkest corner of an empty stall. His knees were pulled up to his chest. He was trembling. He had heard Silas and me raising our voices in the yard. It had terrified him. He was a boy who lived in silence. Loud, angry words broke his fragile world. Silas walked into the barn behind me. He saw Caleb hiding. Silas stopped. He took off his hat. He walked slowly over to the stall and knelt down in the dirt right in front of his son. I stayed back, giving them space. But Silas didn't whisper. He made sure his voice carried clearly across the barn. He wanted me to hear this just as much as Caleb. "I'm sorry you heard that, Caleb," Silas said. His voice was deep and steady. Caleb looked away, his small hands gripping his knees tight. You got scared because Eleanor and I argued, Silas continued. You thought that meant people were leaving. You thought the bad times were coming back. Silas reached out. He gently put his massive hand over Caleb's small ones. Listen to me, son, Silas said, speaking the truth with absolute clarity. Healing doesn't mean pretending the hurt never happened. It doesn't mean we never get angry or scared. Healing means finding the courage to allow ourselves to trust people again and to be loved again, even when we know the risk might cause us pain. We don't hide from the pain, Caleb. We learn how to grow alongside it. People who care about each other will sometimes argue, but real love means you stay to fix it. You don't run away. Caleb slowly turned his head. He looked at his father. Then he looked past Silas's shoulder, right at me. The words hit me like a physical blow. Real love means you stay to fix it. I had been running. Not just from Arthur, from Silas, from the terrifying possibility of needing someone who might disappear. Silas stood up. He patted Caleb's shoulder. He walked out of the stall and stopped in front of me. I need to check the south fence, Silas said quietly. Silas, wait, I said. He stopped. He didn't turn around. I wasn't angry about the money, I confessed to his broad back. My voice shook, but I forced the words out. When Thomas died, I didn't cry, I just worked. I was strong because I didn't have anything left to lose. Silas turned around slowly. He looked at me, his slate-gray eyes entirely focused. I refused your money, I said, because I was terrified. If I let myself depend on you, if I let myself fall into this life with you, and then you leave me, I will finally know what it feels like to lose everything. And I don't think I am strong enough to survive that. It was the most honest I had ever been, the hardest truth I had ever spoken. Silas took a step closer. The distance between us vanished. I'm not Thomas, Silas said. His voice was a low rumble in his chest. I don't quit, and I don't leave. And you can't promise that, I whispered. The prairie takes what it wants. I can't promise tomorrow, Silas agreed. But I can choose today, and I choose to stay right here. He didn't try to hold me. He didn't try to fix it with a kiss. He gave me exactly what I needed, the steady, unwavering truth. The storm broke. The quiet finally settled in. Tomorrow, we would face the judge. But tonight, I wasn't fighting alone. The Coldwater Creek courthouse was packed. Word had spread. Arthur Vance had a big mouth and deep pockets. Half the town came to see the wealthy man from Laramie put a runaway widow in her place. The room smelled of sweat, cheap wool, and wood polish. I sat at the defense table. Nathaniel Hayes sat beside me. He looked calm. He was organizing his papers. Silas sat in the front row, right behind the wooden rail. He had William sitting next to him. Silas sat perfectly still, his hat resting on his knee. Just his presence was a wall at my back. Arthur sat at the plaintiff's table. He wore a fresh suit. He looked smug. He believed he had already won. He had the banknote. He had the law. The judge entered, an older man with a stern face. He banged his gavel. The room went silent. We are here to resolve the custody and competency of Eleanor Vance, the judge announced. Mr. Vance, your counsel may begin. Arthur's lawyer stood up. He walked to the center of the floor. He cleared his throat. Your Honor, the lawyer began, we are here to save 3 innocent children from a tragic situation. Mrs. Vance is a widow. The shock of her husband's death, compounded by the unnatural horrors she witnessed as a wartime nurse, has fractured her mind. She is hysterical. She fled her home in the dead of night like a common criminal. She has abandoned her property, forcing the bank to call in her debts. She is utterly unfit to manage money, land, or human lives. The crowd murmured. It was exactly the story they expected to hear. The judge looked at me over his spectacles. Mr. Hayes, your response? Nathaniel stood up. He didn't walk to the center. He stood right by my side. He picked up the heavy leather-bound journal. Your Honor, Nathaniel said, his voice ringing loud and clear. The plaintiff claims my client's mind is fractured. He claims her time saving lives in a war zone makes her a hysterical liability. Nathaniel walked over to the judge's bench. He laid the journal down. This is Mrs. Vance's medical log from the Shenandoah Valley, Nathaniel stated. 300 pages of complex medical procedures, written by her hand, executed by her mind. She performed amputations, managed disease outbreaks, and rationed supplies for hundreds of men. She made life-or-death decisions with a clarity and precision that most men in this room could never hope to achieve. Arthur shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I want to read a single entry, Nathaniel said, opening the book. Dated October 14th, 1864. Private Miller, age 17. Grape shot to the abdomen. The surgeons gave him up to die. I refused. I cleaned the wound, stitched the bowel, and sat with him for 40 hours until the fever broke. He will go home to his mother. Nathaniel closed the book. The courtroom was dead silent. He turned and looked directly at Arthur, then up to the judge. A person's worth is not measured by their gender, nor by the property in their name, Your Honor, Nathaniel declared, delivering the educational truth loudly for every person in the room to hear. It is measured by the responsibilities they shoulder, the compassion they show, and the lives they save. Stripping this woman of her motherhood simply because she lacks a male guardian is a gross violation of fundamental human rights and basic equality. Her mind is not broken. It is extraordinary. The judge stared at the journal. He looked deeply moved. Arthur panicked. He stood up, knocking his chair back. This is a trick, Arthur yelled, losing his polished composure. She's a stubborn, defiant woman. She owes $400 to the bank right now. She is bankrupt. By sunset today, the Laramie Bank is foreclosing. The Vance land belongs to the Vance family. She has no right to keep that acreage from me. The room gasped. Arthur froze. He realized what he had just said. He had said the quiet part out loud. Nathaniel Hayes smiled. It was the smile of a trap snapping shut. Thank you, Mr. Vance, Nathaniel said smoothly, for finally admitting that your concern was never for the children. Your concern was purely financial. You want the 200 acres. Arthur's lawyer pulled on Arthur's sleeve, trying to get him to sit down. But the damage was done. However, Nathaniel said, turning back to the judge, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single, aged piece of paper. Arthur Vance's greed is based on a fundamental error. Nathaniel handed the paper to the judge. Your Honor, the plaintiff assumes he is next of kin for the property, Nathaniel explained. But Thomas Vance was a smart man. He knew his brother's nature. 5 years ago, Thomas signed a permanent transfer of deed. He moved the 200 acres of Laramie land entirely into Eleanor Vance's name. It was never Thomas's estate to be inherited. It has been Eleanor's sole property from the beginning. Arthur's face drained of all color. That's a lie! That's a forgery! The judge inspected the document. He checked the notary stamps. He looked at Arthur with absolute disgust. It is authentic, the judge said sharply. Mr. Vance, you have attempted to use this court to steal land from a widow under the guise of child welfare. You are a disgrace. The judge banged his gavel so hard it echoed like a gunshot. The emergency injunction is permanently dismissed, the judge barked. Custody remains entirely with Eleanor Vance. And if you ever harass this woman again, Mr. Vance, I will have Sheriff Dawes lock you in a cell. Case closed. The courtroom erupted into cheers. I sat in my chair. My hands were shaking. I looked back at the gallery. Silas was already standing. He touched the brim of his hat to me, a silent salute. We walked out of the courthouse into the bright Wyoming sun. Arthur Vance slunk out the back door, ruined and humiliated. I stood on the boardwalk, breathing in the free air. Silas stood beside me. You did it, Silas said. We did it, I corrected him. I looked at him. Something was tugging at my mind. Silas, how did you know Nathaniel Hayes would take my case? You brought me straight to Judge Carter. Silas looked out toward the street. He rubbed his jaw. Jed, Silas said simply. Jed? I asked, confused. The ranch hand I stitched up? Jed was in the infantry in the Shenandoah, Silas explained quietly. When you were fixing his chest, he recognized you. He told me he saw you save 30 men in 2 days. He told me about the medical journal you used to carry. He told me you were a legend among the enlisted men. I stared at him. You knew? You knew about my journal before I even showed it to Nathaniel? I knew, Silas admitted. Why didn't you say anything? I asked, completely shocked. Why didn't you tell me to use it against Arthur on the first day? Silas turned to me. His eyes were completely sincere. Because it wasn't my story to tell, Eleanor, Silas explicitly stated. And it wasn't my weapon to draw. A man doesn't empower a woman by making her decisions for her. True respect means giving you the space to fight your own battles on your own terms, and trusting that you are strong enough to know when to strike. I didn't want to take your agency away. I felt a tear finally break loose. It tracked hot down my dusty cheek. I didn't wipe it away. I didn't need to hide anymore. Take me home, Silas, I said. 3 months later, the heat of late summer baked the Wyoming grass to a golden brown. The Laramie Bank issue had been resolved. With the deed firmly in my name, Nathaniel Hayes easily negotiated a fair sale of a small parcel of the Laramie land to pay off the taxes. The rest we kept. But I didn't move back. We stood in Judge Carter's small parlor room in Coldwater Creek. It was a Tuesday morning, nothing fancy. I wasn't wearing white. I wore my best blue cotton dress, the color of the prairie sky. Silas wore a clean white shirt and a dark vest. He looked incredibly handsome. William, Abigail, and Samuel stood to my left. Caleb stood next to his father. Nathaniel Hayes was leaning against the doorway, grinning like a fool. Judge Carter held a small leather book. Silas Thorne, Eleanor Vance, the judge said softly. We aren't here for a big show. We are here to make a family legal. Do you, Silas, take this woman? I do, Silas said. He didn't look at the judge. He looked right at me. And do you, Eleanor, take this man? I do, I said. My voice was clear. No doubts. No fear. Then, by the power vested in me, Judge Carter smiled. You are husband and wife. There was no grand music. Just the sound of the wind rattling the window panes. Silas reached out and took both of my hands. His thumbs gently traced my knuckles. He didn't recite a poem. He just spoke his heart. I see you, Eleanor, Silas vowed softly. I choose you, and I will keep choosing you every single day. I squeezed his hands. Suddenly, a small movement caught my eye. Caleb stepped forward. He walked right up to the space between Silas and me. He looked up. His dark slate-gray eyes were wide, but they weren't afraid anymore. He reached out and wrapped his small fingers around my wrist. He took a deep breath. His small chest hitched. And for the first time in 2 years, he pushed a sound past his lips. It was raspy. It was quiet. But it was the most beautiful sound in the world. Mama, Caleb said. I dropped to my knees in my good blue dress. I threw my arms around him, pulling him tight against my chest. Silas knelt down right beside us, wrapping his massive arms around both of us. William, Abigail, and Samuel rushed in, piling on top in a messy, tearful, laughing heap. We were a family, forged in the fire, held together by choice. 5 years later. Autumn, 1883. From the Journal of William Thorne, age 17. I sat on the top rail of the corral fence, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. The sky was burning orange and purple. Down in the yard, Silas was showing Caleb how to rope a stubborn calf. Caleb was 12 now. He didn't talk as much as other boys, but he never stopped talking to us. His voice was steady. He was going to be a hell of a rancher one day. Abigail was 13, and she was currently lecturing a highly confused farm dog about the proper way to herd sheep. Samuel was 9, sitting on the porch, reading one of Mama's old medical textbooks. He already knew how to splint a broken leg. We don't call it the Vance Ranch or the Thorn Ranch anymore. It's just home. We sold the rest of the Laramie acreage a few years back and bought the adjoining valley. We have 500 head of cattle now. I watched the front door of the house open. Mama walked out. She had a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She carried 2 tin cups of coffee. She walked down the steps and stood by the fence, watching Silas work. Silas handed the rope to Caleb, dusted off his jeans, and walked over to her. He took a cup of coffee. He leaned against the fence, his shoulder touching hers. They didn't say much. They never really had to. I pulled my pencil from behind my ear and opened my leather journal. I looked at them, and I thought about that freezing night 5 years ago. That man knew my mother was hiding in his wagon in the dead of night, and he said nothing. I wrote, the lead scratching softly against the paper. People talk a lot about what makes a family. They think it's just blood. They think it's sharing a last name. But that's a lie. I paused, making sure I got the words exactly right. I wanted Samuel to read this one day. I wanted to explicitly state the truth my mother and Silas had taught me. Human compassion often starts exactly like that night on the wagon, I wrote, underlining the words. It starts by witnessing someone else's pain, keeping silent to protect them, and opening your doors when they need it most. Family is not just what you are born into. Family is the people who respect your equality, who defend your dignity, and who choose to stay when the storm gets rough. Love is not a sudden feeling. It is a daily choice. And choosing to care for one another is the only legacy that truly lasts. I closed the journal. I hopped down from the fence. "Will," Silas called out from the yard, "stop daydreaming and come help your brother with this calf." "Coming, Pa," I yelled back. I ran toward the corral, the Wyoming wind at my back, entirely free. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.
This channel brings you raw stories of cowboys, frontier love, motherhood, and the human spirit that refuses to break. The meaning behind this story is simple. Freedom, dignity, and love are things worth fighting for, no matter the cost. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more stories from the frontier. Out on the wide, unforgiving prairie, where the wind cuts deep and the law does not always mean justice. Stories like this are not just told, they are earned. What we have witnessed is more than a tale of survival. It is the quiet, unbreakable strength of a mother who refused to let the world decide her worth. Eleanor did not win because she was the strongest, or the loudest, or the most powerful. She endured because she understood something far greater, that dignity is not granted by society, and love is not measured by wealth or status. It is carried within, fought for in silence, and proven through action when everything else is stripped away. This story reminds us that true courage does not always look like standing tall in the daylight. Sometimes it looks like walking into the dark with trembling hands, and still choosing to move forward. It shows us that justice is not always found in the systems built by men, but often in the choices we make when faced with fear, loss, and impossible odds. Eleanor's journey teaches us that equality is not a favor handed down. It is a birthright that must be defended, even when the cost is everything. And perhaps most importantly, it reveals that strength is not hardness. Real strength is compassion. It is the ability to protect, to understand, and to stand beside others without trying to own them. Through Silas, we see another truth, one that is often forgotten in harsh lands like the frontier. A strong man is not one who dominates, but one who respects, one who listens, one who chooses to stand with, not above. And through the children, through William's anger, Abigail's fear, and Samuel's innocence, we are reminded that the future is shaped not by what we say, but by what we teach through our actions. Kindness, respect, and resilience are lessons that echo far beyond a single lifetime. In the end, this is a story about humanity in its rawest form, about the quiet bond between strangers, about the courage to trust again after loss, about the belief that even in a world that tries to break you, you can still choose who you become. The prairie is vast, cold, and often merciless, but within it, there is also space for something else to grow, something enduring, something real. And maybe that is the greatest lesson of all. No matter how harsh the world becomes, the human spirit, when rooted in love, dignity, and truth, will always find a way to rise,